Nandana Jaya Brajajana Ranjana Jaya Brajajana Ranjana Yashodanandana Jaya Yamuna Tiravana Chari Jaya Kunja Bihari Yamuna Tiravana Chari Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Jaya Kunja Bihari We made it. Everyone helped a bit. Om Jnanatimirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah. Radhika Gopinath, the Gopinath of Radha. Radha has Gopinath. That's the translation in English, right? Radhika Gopinath. Well, just a little recap last night. At least a few of you were here last night, but what's interesting, what makes Bhagavad Gita, first last night I said that Bhagavad Gita is by far the most influential Vedic text in history, and pronouncedly Bhagavad Gita over time has been quite important in the mind of people outside of the Vedic tradition. And this is rather remarkable, because people have a tendency to what's the term? No, they have a tendency to to group up. They have a tendency to herd. Now I just made this word up. There's the noun herd, but you can make it a verb also. So people have a tendency to herd. In other words, to live in groups, and it is a, some people say it's provincial to think and feel like that, to behave like that, but there are also legitimate needs. Cultural needs, psychological needs. Like, for example, typically the way American Indians express their emotions is not typical the way Americans, for example, express it. And actually one almost stuns the other. Hare Krishna. One almost stuns the other. So to be the people with the people from the same cultural group is quite normal. So in this way, people tend to group up, and this is one of the reasons. But there are other reasons for which work from one tradition tends to not go outside of the tradition. People also tend to be sectarian because they say that that aggression is a symptom of compensation. When you lack on something, then you need to compensate for it, and then you become aggressive. So people who were typically very aggressive about their beliefs suggests that their beliefs are infirm. And they're very often infirm because they don't sit on firm basis. Like, for example, national identity. What's the basis for national identity? Hardly anything. I mean, in India also you have these nationalists who are hyper-Hindu, right? They have to be hyper-Hindu because the very concept of nationality is not completely illusory, but it's pretty illusory. There's no basis upon which to base one's identity with the nation that one was born in. But people tend to do that, take pride in being of a certain nation. So then they compensate. They compensate, and so people become ultra nationalistic. Or, for example, I grew up in the Mediterranean, the country of Croatia, and people there are typically Catholics, and people identify Catholicism with nationality, which is it's an insanity. It's absolute. What does Catholicism have to do? What does religion have to do with nationality? And so these people tend to be hyper Catholic, hyper Catholic. So these are some of the reasons why works that are generally found in one tradition don't make it over to some other tradition. Now, Bhagavad Gita is so pronouncedly philosophical. So pronouncedly philosophical that Bhagavad Gita has managed to find its way into the minds and hearts of people of other traditions. Now, because Bhagavad Gita was spoken to Arjuna within a certain space and at a certain time, there were cultural things going on. So a lot of the vocabulary that Krishna uses is actually time specific. But he uses it only as examples to illustrate principles way beyond these details. So Bhagavad Gita is pronouncedly philosophical. And what makes Bhagavad Gita very relatable to people, and it tends to be relatable not to common people, because like my mother, I gave her a copy of Bhagavad Gita. She couldn't even begin to read that. She just does not have the intellectual acumen to do that. Let alone to follow the flow of the topics, or to. I remember once having a conversation, and one person was telling me that the idea of hats is illusory. And I'll tell you why I'm saying this. Because smart people can recognize categories. If you're not intelligent, you cannot recognize categories. And literally, the function of intelligence is recognition. As they say, there might be cognition, but no recognition. Like, for example, when you haven't seen someone in a very long while, like back there, Mataji, I thought she was her mother because of some resemblance. There's cognition. Certain information is imprinted into our brains, and but then to make the connection, that's the function of the intelligence. So intelligent people, literally people in whom intelligence has not gone asleep, they can recognize categories. That's the function of intelligence. So when one reads a work like Bhagavad Gita, the point of it is to recognize categories. So there's categories of hats. Somehow or other, it's hard to define the difference between a hat and a shoe, because each could be worn either on the head or on the feet. But yet somewhere or other we manage to recognize the difference between hats and there are all kinds of hats. And there's all kinds of shoes. But still, shoes tend to fit better on feet and hats tend to fit better on the head. And so I met this person who was obviously a contemporary Mayavadi and was trying to tell me, there is no category of anything. There's just shape. But there is. You're intelligent, you can recognize. If I tell you, please give me my hat, you're not going to give me a mic stand. Because the category is just obvious. So similarly amongst animals, we see 4 legs, tail, barks, doesn't meow, it's a dog. Even though there are dogs that look like horses, but nearly as big as horses, but still we don't say it's a cow or a horse, we say it's a dog. Because we have, our intelligence works. For example, one thing that destroys intelligence are drugs. Drugs literally alter the capability of intelligence. Again, intelligence means to gather all the information and sort it out. And when a person is intoxicated or intoxicated by lower modes, loses ability to recognize categories. So when people literally take substances, not mind, but intelligence-altering substances, drugs, then a person loses ability to recognize. The functions of the buddhi become compromised. And so Bhagavad Gita, even though occasionally using details, it's not really meant to leave us stuck on details. It's meant to communicate principles. Principles, as opposed to details, are categories. Details are just information. And principles are literally categories. And when one understands the category, then one actually understands the principles, not other way around. One who understands the details never comes to understand principles. So, so when one studies a work like Bhagavad Gita, to the extent they're not under the influence of lower modes, then their intelligence can grasp categories of ideas, and understand what is actually Krishna here saying. And so what makes Bhagavad Gita really relatable to people, again, to all people except those whose buddhi is really gone asleep, which is unfortunately insane a lot of people, especially in modern times, when there is no culture of even amongst devotees, very often there's a lack of culture of thinking. And especially fine thinking. Not that we're not interested in fine. We're interested in Krishna and thinking about Krishna. But Krishna is fine thinking, and Krishna himself is being very fine. Ourselves not knowing Krishna, it takes some finesse to get a glimpse of who or what Krishna is, and so. That philosophical nature of the Bhagavad Gita is very appealing, and it opens with external tension, which then transforms very quickly in Arjuna into an internal tension. And that's usually how it goes in this world. And that internal tension then brings about, puts Arjuna in the position of literally existential crisis. And it's usually like that, existential. Do you know what existential crisis means?
What is my existence?
Yes, yeah. Why do I exist? I mean, should I just like not exist? Or if I should exist, why should I exist? Yeah, the purpose, yeah. And these existential crises manifest in varieties of ways. I mean, typically we don't think about it, but if you sharpen your buddhi, your intelligence, then when you look at your life, you see that your life is basically one steady flow. Mataji, Hare Krishna. Can you tell her to, it's maybe some other time, yeah. Must be village people. what was I saying? That flow. That our life is basically one flow, one constant flow of inspiration. And by inspiration, we move from one second into another, from one space into another. That's our life. Not only our, but everybody's life. Everyone's life is nothing but a flow of inspiration. Inspiration that takes us literally from one second into another, from one space into another. But what happens when you lose inspiration? You literally have no inspiration. You have existential crisis. You somehow or other exist, the time goes on and the space around you changes, and time, as an invincible force, a river, pushes you into a change. But you don't know why and how. And so you experience existential crisis. And this is good because everyone, first of all, everyone undergoes external and then internal turmoil. But what makes Arjuna's conversation with Krishna fantastic is that Arjuna did not go see a shrink. He did not go see a psychiatrist, which some people would do. Because you see, people generally don't seek to remove their troubles awesomely, just peripherally, because they have their own agenda. But that's a difference in the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna makes that difference between a jnani and between one who's after knowledge and one who's merely curious. Jignasu, yeah. One who's merely curious does not want to change. That person has his own agenda that's rolling on or rolling out. But one jnani is one who actually wants to know and then mold his life according to what he finds out. It's a huge difference. So typically people are life cowards. In other words, they have a little program where they have found some comfort, and then they want to, by any what's the term? By any means, yes, thank you. By any means, at any price, keep that comfort. But throughout, actually, I read several works, they're not by devotees, but they beautifully bring out this tension in the reader. Where you, by the end of the book, you're really asking yourself, what am I primarily interested in? Am I primarily interested in comfort or meaning? Do I want to just have a comfortable existence, or do I want to have a meaningful existence? Of course, these two don't have to diverge all the time, but they do diverge. And which way do you go then? Actually, this topic is one of the topics of Bhagavad Gita, mentioned briefly, because Bhagavad Gita is really a brief work, yet it encompasses everything. So it's only briefly mentioned, but it is mentioned, this topic. So typically people are cowards in the sense that they don't. We have tendency to be cowards, to not be open and ready to change ourselves. So people have the same attitude towards religion. To them, religion is yet another thing that's meant to provide comfort to them. But again, you have the same tension. What are you interested in, comfort or truth? When someone asks you a question, then you can say, do you want me to tell you a lie or a truth? Should I lie or should I speak the truth? So when Arjuna approached Krishna, he did not go to a shrink or to someone who's just going to make it comfy for him, so he can live through these otherwise turbulent times. No, he went to Krishna. And Krishna being the Parama Guru, or Adi Guru actually, not Parama Guru, Adi Guru, the original spiritual master, did not have it light for him. He had it Guru, heavy. Heavy means dense with content. And he put it literally all in perspective for Arjuna. So in this way, these existential crises that Arjuna experienced grew into something beautiful. Not just something beautiful, but ultimately beautiful. So also our lives, when we experience external tension, that tends to trigger internal tension, which then should trigger not hiding, but seeking. Not hiding. Not hiding in the chambers of comfort, but seeking the truth. And this is a paramount illusion, that comfort brings comfort. Comfort is ultimately the most uncomfortable thing, because it really takes you away from truth. Prabhupada wrote that essay, right? Can the truth and beauty be compatible? Because people tend to think that, right? They tend to think that truth is not beautiful. And they tend to run away from it, because they don't want to conform to it. They prefer to keep their own program going on. And so Arjuna approached Krishna, and then Krishna literally covered everything. And so yoga is the topic of the Bhagavad Gita. Yoga is the topic of Bhagavad Gita. And in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna really blows your mind as to what constitutes yoga. What's the title? Most often given title, there's no originally given titles as far as I know to the chapters of Bhagavad Gita, but in due course of time, people, I don't know, maybe our chart, I really don't know. I just know that many different versions of Bhagavad Gita that I had in my hands from different sampradayas had different titles for the chapters, but nearly identical. However, I do know that in Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita is not titled. Does anyone know what's the most common given title to the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita? That's one of the, that's Prabhupada's title, yes.
No, Prabhu is asking in general, Maharaj is asking in general how people know.
Yeah. Or is it the first? No, it's the first chapter. It's the first chapter. I apologize. That's right, the first chapter. Arjuna, yeah, that's why I confused you. I said second. I apologize, my mistake here. Arjuna Vishada Yoga. Krishna calls Arjuna's existential crisis yoga. I mean Krishna, whoever titled it afterwards, because it is yoga. And Krishna literally, because yoga means to connect. And so Krishna puts this idea of yoga completely in our perspective, beginning with Arjuna's crisis. Arjuna's turmoil is yoga. It's God-given thing. People don't think like that, but it's a God-given thing. It's an indicator. It's what do you call it? Incentive. I'm bilingual, and then when I remember a word in one language, then I can't remember it in the other. Like one language tends to pollute the other. It's a literally divine incentive for spiritual progress. That's another thing that in Bhagavad Gita we get a picture of what actually constitutes spiritual progress. That's a topic for tonight's discussion, but so I won't say it now. So those were the reasons for. Just to finish that yoga thing. Krishna really gives us a fantastic concept of what yoga is, and yoga really there's no beginning to yoga really. Because, for example, in Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, we speak of the soul departing, leaving Krishna, leaving the spiritual world to come into the material world. And then we say that in one point, the person starts to starts the process of going back to Godhead. But really, if we were to think about it, there is no point, there is no second that we can point out or we can point to and to say that was the beginning. Because there's no end and there's no beginning. The very descent into the material world is a beginning. That in itself is a beginning. This whole material world has a purpose, and its purpose is yoga. It appears as if it is taking souls away from Krishna, but it's not this world that takes souls away from Krishna. It is the souls who have absolute independence to use their freedom in such a capacity, and so some do. And this world is not meant for yoga, it's meant for yoga. It is meant for joining souls with God in a divine bhakti union. Sometimes sentimentally called love. It is love, but English term love, just we'd have to first discuss that before we can use it. So there is no beginning, really. Everything is, the soul cannot break the union with God, because soul is an intrinsic part of God. The Vaishnavacharyas give the example of the sun and the sun rays. If you speak of sun, there is sun rays. There cannot be sun without sun rays. There is no God without souls. There are no souls without God. They're integral part. They're like one thing. Still, we differentiate between the sun and the sun rays. Sun does not emanate from the sun rays. It's the sun rays that emanates from the sun. It's a very good example. So that is yoga, and Krishna gives us this concept of yoga, and really, I mean, it begins everywhere. But specifically in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna puts it in some brackets. You have to bracket it somewhere. So he brackets it with Arjuna's internal tension. And then he goes through all different popular, in those days, popular concepts of yoga, such as Sankhya, Dhyana, Karma. He covers it all. They may not be very popular these days, but the concepts do exist these days, and people do practice these things in very same principles. So Bhagavad Gita in this way is a synthetic work in the sense of synthesis, that it brings all of these conclusions on one pile. Krishna sorts them out and gives a conclusion. Just a couple of more sentences and I'm done. Well, actually, just one sec. Make sure that, because there were some notes that I did not cover last night, and I'm not sure if I even want to now. No, I won't. I maybe one, like Gita's conclusion, for example. Gita's conclusion, and this again, it's not really elaborated upon in the Bhagavad Gita, the conclusion of the Bhagavad Gita, because it's a very brief work. Very, very brief work, but it's really all-encompassing. The conclusion of Bhagavad Gita is that one should live and act out of love, specifically love, devotion for God. And then what do you do if that's not your position? Then you should act, think, feel, act, etc., out of duty, but for that love. This is very important. I know it's just a, what do you call it, a little summary, but because sometimes people ask them, this is a religious work. It's a philosophical presentation, but it's a religious work. And often people are having a hard time to understand what is religion, or what constitutes morality, etc., etc. What constitutes morality, what constitutes religion, is that person acts out of love. By mere external circumstances, you cannot define what is religion. Merely by external circumstances, you cannot define what is morality, what is right, what is wrong. Often people ask this. Hard external rules are given for people who cannot understand and are not on the platform of love of God. But every activity, every thought, everything that comes out of a heart that's devoted to God is perfection, is good. And everything that does not come out of that place is bad, is immoral, not right. That's the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. But then, what to do? This is another thing that has been abused since the dawn of creation. Having heard of this otherwise elevated concept, people have, in the name of God, been acting immorally as hell. From killing and torturing and raping and God knows what not, in the name of God, in the name of love of God. To what you find in India, sleeping with other people's wives, and anything goes out of... It's just lying. And sometimes they become so absorbed in it that they believe that they're acting out of love of God. But you look at them and you're thinking, this guy's just off. Like in the Bhagavatam, there's a description of Nara Narayana, who's sometimes described as one person, sometimes as two. It's got to have a little foam here, otherwise it makes noise when you breathe at it or on it. There's description of Narayana Rishi, and physical description, and you can see it says that the life of austerity was obvious, that the divine life of austerity was obvious in the appearance of the sage. Is this being broadcast? Then I'll tell you afterwards. Okay, I won't mention any names then. But you know this rascal goes by the name of Paramahamsa. It's just a cheater, the cheapest of cheaters. I didn't know this person. I just saw a picture of him, and it was very obvious to me. This person, he's filled with material desires, not up to his ears, but brimming. His material desires are shooting through the openings of his body. And I was right. Shortly after, then after that, I saw him being mentioned in magazines, etc., etc. A guy from India. And then eventually his whole enterprise was exposed, and just another sense grabbing, another materialist in the garb of a sadhu. But why was I saying that? There was one last point I wanted to make, and now I forgot. Just my mind got hijacked by this guy. To act out of love. And how that's being abused. Because often when you bring this up, right, people say, what about all the violence done in the name of religion? Because those people did not have love of God. One of the symptoms of love of God is that one literally loves every single being. What is that? Sarva bhuteshu yah pashyat bhagavad bhavam atmanaha bhutani bhagavatyatmani saesha bhagavatattamaha. And what's the one from the Bhagavad Gita? One who sees me everywhere, and one who sees me everywhere and everyone in me. He's never lost to me, neither am I lost to him. Anyhow, when you don't repeat shlokas for some time, they evaporate. So the conclusion of the Bhagavad Gita is to act out of love, which is not understood by people who are not devotees, and especially serious devotees. And if you're not, and this is very important, if you're not on the platform of devotion, platform of pure love of Krishna, then you act out of duty but for love. And this is also very important. Because if we act out of duty but not for love, then our bhakti is covered and we're not practicing bhakti, and our heart does not grow, or our consciousness does not grow in bhakti, grows in something else. In other words, we do things out of duty but we do them for other things. If you do things for jnana, you become a jnani. Otherwise you could do very same thing, intellectual endeavor, but you do it because you want love of Krishna. You become a devotee. That's very important. So, and it's not something that's easy to maintain. Otherwise we would all become quickly pure devotees, but we just don't become pure devotees that easy. Because even though we act out of this, that and the other thing, but we don't act for love, for bhakti, for devotion. That's not necessarily our sole motivation. There's always some additives. Name, fame, glory. Same old story. Just remember a band from Europe used to sing that. Okay, any questions or comments on this second part of the intro? Yes, Praj.
The knowledge is all coming to a fire and then Krishna categorizes it. So, is it an ontological classification because those categories exist in the spiritual world, or is it just a categorization for convenience?
These yogas do not exist in the spiritual world. So in that sense, it is an ontological classification because ontologically they exist, but not in the spiritual world. They ontologically exist, but in the material world. There is no need for yoga practice in the spiritual world. The spiritual world is inhabited only by perfect beings who are already on the platform of bhakti, who are thinking, feeling, willing only out of the urge of devotion for Krishna. And as far as I know, can't remember, I haven't been there in a while.
Do these categorizations exist because people are in various planes, or?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Because that's the manifestation of a beautiful heart of God. And that's generally manifestation of any good heart, that a teacher in the early days of my monastic life, I had a service, well, relatively early. I had a service of training new bhaktas, and they were under my care. And I remember once complaining to my roommate that this bhakta just doesn't listen. Whatever I tell him, he doesn't do, etc., etc. And then at one point, this person who was listening from me had enough of it. And he said, why don't you be merciful? Of course he's like that. Of course he's like that. Everybody's like that. Prabhupada said that missionary work is something like going into an insane asylum where everybody's nuts, where everybody's ill. They're literally out of their minds. But you're not out of your mind, hopefully. And therefore you ought to help them. And merely condemning them just doesn't help. We already know, yeah, sure, people are nonsense. So what to do? You have to rise above that. And so that's why different levels or different forms of religion, because of different capacities in which people are conditioned. Just like a school zone. Why is the traffic speed so low in a school zone? Because kids are idiots. Their ball may jump onto the street and they'll run onto the street without looking at traffic. Kids are, their brains are half dead. All they can think about is sense gratification, and a kid's brain's not very developed, but yours is. So even though it's not your fault, it's a street, you can travel full speed, why not? But there are kids nearby who are dumb. And you have to understand that their brains are not developed. And hopefully yours is, and therefore you're the one who actually alters your behavior for their good. And this is something that a genuine missionary understands and practices. Often we find that people who are consciously not developed enough to be good missionaries, they simply do things to people. They tell them stuff. It just doesn't work like that. Real missionary, real preacher is one who feels and understands the person's position, and then extends down to the person that which is actually good for the person. And good is that which person can actually digest, that will actually help him. Often people meet someone and then just tell him everything. And then the person never comes again. But I gave him a good dose of Krishna consciousness. He's now saved. He's now saved for several lifetimes. He won't come back to you or your institution, or sometimes even the idea of religion. Did you tell him something wrong? No, everything you said is correct, but it's just bounced the person 1,000,000 miles. So what's required is deep compassion and tolerance on the part of the preacher. And we find this in God Himself. That's why there are different concepts of religion. Like yagya. Yagya is a process of sacrifice, and literally it is a process that returns soul back to God. And yet we find human sacrifices in the Vedic literature. That's like the most abominable thing ever. But it's there. For the lowest of people. Or animal sacrifices. Animal sacrifices are absolutely abominable. But we find them in the Vedic literature. We also find condemnation of it. But it's there in the Vedic literature. So we, as those of us who are magnificent enough to try to serve Krishna in this way, to actually help other people, which is the best thing we can do to serve Krishna. If we don't understand this, then means we're not very consciously developed, and we're not too great of a missionary. But Krishna is perfect, and so we find that reflecting in the world of religion. That's why varieties of yoga or religion, which then further compounds the situation, because if you have someone who's on this platform, but then you have a religious concept that's on this platform, this person should not do that, because that's a step down. Like in the beginning of the Bhagavatam, we find Narada Muni telling Vyasadeva that it's abominable that he has compiled Vedic literatures. But yet he didn't erase them, they're still there. He didn't burn them or something. They're still there. So it's interesting that the dichotomy or the dynamics in that relationship. That literature is there because it's needed because people are just abominable. So they need an abominable form of religion to go down, relate to them, and pull them up a bit, like that. But yet, for someone who's above, should understand that that's, as Bhagavatam puts it, abominable. Karma kanda, jnana kanda. It's like 2 cups of poison. Vishe, yeah. Visha means poison, right? In Bengali. How's my Bengali pronunciation? Any Bengalis in the room? We have no Bengali representation today. How do you say poison in Bengali? Bish, bish. Yeah. V becomes B, yeah. Bish. Thank you. That was a good question. Yes.
Just to add a comment on the existence of crisis. So I was with one of my friends outside, and when he said, if you don't take drinks, no meat, no eating, whatever you say, no. He literally said, why did you come in this world?
Existential crisis. Oh, Krishna. Oh, animal. That was a good one. I mean, I heard that many times before, but never thought of it as existential crisis. I'll use this next time. I'm crying from smiling. Oh, Krishna. That was a good joke. As they say, watch and weep. When something's so sad, you can't tell whether you should laugh or smile. Then they say, watch and weep, and then they smile. They laugh at it. Yeah, it's just an animal, really. One who has that. I mean, no need to hate on the person, but we shouldn't be confused. That's a very animalistic platform of existence. Satisfying basic prime biological needs is somehow the goal of life. Very, very crude existence. Yeah. Okay, any last thing perhaps? Yes.
Why in Bhagavad Gita Krishna has to say that I am the compiler of Vedanta? Like he the person who was like created all existence. And when he's talking about why did this say that I know all the results and like why does he have to like qualify or quantify that for people then? And even like when he's showing like if you relate it.
Well, the purpose of that statement is not to make sure that everyone understands that he's the compiler of the Vedas, but specifically in that section of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is establishing his divinity. And in order to do that, because in due course of conversation sort of sought that element. And so Krishna included that element in the conversation. And in order to portray the nature of his divinity, he listed all those things. And even if it was outside of the conversation, yes, there is need to establish Krishna's divinity, because it's good for the souls to know that, and many souls do not know that. As a matter of fact, even now many people contest that there is an origin, and especially that origin is a conscious being, a person, supreme being, God. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavad Gita ki, Srila Prabhupada ki.